Greetings, welcome to the show. Today we're going to take a look at a subject which I think it has been brought to light more recently after this Black Lives Matter thing blew up in around 2020. But it's an issue that has been ongoing really. It's regarding the wealth of the UK during the colonial period and the Industrial Revolution era, and whether that wealth included wealth generated through the slave trade and the slave economy, which included the slave labor of Africans in the Americas and the Caribbean. So that's what I'll be taking a look at. So UK's economic growth during the colonial and the slavery period, it seemed to have, some argue that it was that the slave trade basically and the slave economy didn't contribute much to the UK's economy during that period. These are the people who, it seems, would like to play down the role colonialism played in the growth of the British economy. But two papers I've read alongside a book called The Underdevelopment of Africa by Walter Rodney would indicate quite. There are other papers and books, but I'm focusing primarily on these three, which give, particularly the papers or the reports, give some detailed information into the contributions from the slave economy into investments in the UK's manufacturing and industrial growth in particular regions of the UK. So, taking a look at Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, it gives a broad outline of some of the things that were involved in this process of how Europe interfered in Africa's economy, particularly the textile industry, and how African artisans, the role they played had declined because of the importation of cheap textiles from the UK. So, taking a look at textiles itself, the textile industry in the UK benefited from the profits of the slave trade or the slave economy. Steam engines in particular received some amount of investment. If we take a look at, for example, James Watt, in 1765, when he developed his version of the steam engine, this development was invested in by those who earned their living from the slave trade or from the slave economy in the Americas, and the money they used that to invest in his research basically and his development of his steam engine. I'll read you some information from. This is from Walter Rodney's book, The Underdevelopment of Africa, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Then there was James Watt expressing eternal gratitude to the West Indian slave owners who directly financed his famous steam engine and took it from the drawing board to the factory. So from the very designing of a steam engine, slave finance was involved. And then starting with the period 1792 to 1830, we find a strong link between slavery and steam engine adoption. The effect increases over time, and the slave-owning area's edge grows in magnitude after slave-owning areas. That means, what they're talking about is the areas of the UK where the slave owners resided, even though they had their plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. When the money came back to them in the UK, they invested in their regions, and you saw an increase in industrial development. So here he's saying this is from slavery and the Industrial Revolution. This is one of the reports I'm talking about. To sum up, regions from which slave traders experienced beneficial conditions held at more slave wealth in 1833. This had effects on economic development, land values increased consistent with increased urbanization. The share of employment in agriculture declined The share in manufacturing increased. There were more industrial establishments and more steam engines. This is in the vicinity of where these slaveholders, these are the people who owned slaves in the Americas, when the plantations reaped their benefits, they invested in their regions of the UK, and you find more people moving to the cities to work in the factories that they set up, or the factories or industries, I should say, that they invested in. And agriculture also declined in those regions as more people moved towards the cities. So there's a relationship there between the steam engine use and the development of the steam engine and investments from the money earned through the slave trade and the slave economy. If we look at the textile industry itself, the contributions to the British economy during the period was quite significant. That's what they're arguing in one of their reports. With 20% of the population dependent on cotton textile manufacturing, also textiles reach 40% of UK's exports during the colonial period, with 75% of the cotton used coming out of the Americas, which was being produced in the Americas through the use of slaves. In regards to the cotton trade, the value added in an industry which was based on cotton from the American plantation complex, in particular, grew from virtually zero to an average of 4.6 million during the first decade of the 19th century. The 19th century is the beginning of the 1800s. From the beginning of the 1800s, it was quite low, and during the 19th century, it grew. Some argue up to 10 or to 100%, something like that. Here's another piece of information. By 1860, Great Britain, the world's most powerful country, had become the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and a significant part of the nation's industry was cotton textiles. Nearly 4 million of Britain's total population of 21 million were dependent on cotton textile manufacturing. Nearly 40% of Britain's exports were cotton textiles, 75%, as I said before. Other cotton supplied came from America. So imagine 20% of the population were somehow involved in the cotton textile industry. So that's a good percentage of the population that's involved in an industry which people of today would say that there wasn't really much significance in terms of slavery in its relation to the UK's economy at the time. But the information provided here seems to say something else. So I've looked at the steam engine and cotton, and that's a textile. Those are two subjects relating to the Industrial Revolution itself. There's another item or resource, you might say. Palm oil. Palm oil, although it didn't come from the Americas, it came initially from West Africa and then later on from the Congo region or Central Africa. The British made an agreement with the Belgian government to occupy or to use several square miles of land for the production of palm oil. And in the UK, palm oil was used throughout Europe, it was used for a variety of products. Even up to today, palm oil is still important to the UK's economy. So I'll start here. The statistics from 1830 indicate that palm oil sold at Liverpool markets at 10 times the price for which it was purchased from African producers. In Europe, palm oil greased the wheels of engines of empire, providing crucial lubricant for industrial machines, railway locomotives, steamship engines, and so forth. So it is a very important commodity for the UK's industrial development. It was also crucial for a number of consumer products of the late 19th century: soap, cheap candles, tin cans, and later edible margarine. So palm oil, even up to today, I think it's still in margarine. It was lust for this almost magical substance that brought Europeans to West Africa. Well, I don't think it's the only. I think gold was also a commodity, as well as cocoa. So, apart from slaves, obviously, or Africans to be taken into slavery. But there are several commodities taken or that were in high demand from West Africa throughout that period. But yes, palm oil was an important. But then again, cocoa, chocolate had become very popular during that time. And another one. Meanwhile, palm oil became one of the essential ingredients of capitalist imperial modernity. To give a sense of the scale, palm oil imports to Britain, which controlled around 3/4 of the global trade, increased by a factor of 566 from 1807 until 1897. That's over a period of 90 years. It grew by a factor of over 500. Is that 500% or 566 times? Which is a huge increase in terms of the use of that product. It originally came from farmers producing palm oil in West Africa. They would sell to the British when their produce was ready. And it was an irregular supply, but then they got a supply from the people in Congo, from plantations in Congo, when they made an agreement with the Belgian government. Then you have Unilever. Unilever is a company which still exists today, and it's a very well-known company. Here it's talking about their treatment of African workers on their palm oil plantations. But Lever's treatment of African workers directly inherited the forms of discipline and cruelty forged on these same coasts in the slave trade, renovated and combined with the latest theories and practices of plantation management. And this one contrasts, I think, with how they treated European workers. Their workers who might otherwise be forced to live crammed into festering tenements in the thick smog of the industrial city were invited to inhabit generous townhouses in a purpose-built estate, a place where vices like drinking, non-matrimonial sex, and gambling were strictly policed. So the African workers were treated very badly, but the European workers, the estates constructed for them, well-designed estates constructed for them, so they could live in a spacious environment, basically. The profits earned from either the direct trading of slaves or from the industries engaged in the use of slave labor. This money was invested in various regions of the UK, as I was saying, and the regions where slave owners resided developed at a much higher rate than other regions of the UK as a whole, I think, benefited, but particular regions more than others. So I'm going to look at some of the investment factors relating to this. So as he's saying, the location with the greatest levels of participation in slavery investment experienced increases in total income of more than 40%, with the capitalist income increasing by more than 100%. So the regions where the profits from slavery and slave-holding economies, where those owners lived, had an increase of around 40% investment in their development. In terms of buying land, constructing factories, and so forth, and the development of industrial equipment, we find that greater slavery wealth promoted local economic growth and led to a reallocation of economic activity from agriculture and towards manufacturing, and the diffusion of new manufacturing technology. They're mainly focusing on cotton mills here and the steam engine, and the adoption of steam power, the key new technology of the Industrial Revolution. So the steam engine or steam power, which was, according to this, is an important factor in their industrial development. It had a lot of investment from people who were involved in the slave trade and the slave economy. Outstanding examples are provided in the persons of David and Alexander Barclay, who were engaging in the slave trade in 1756, who later used the loot to set up Barclay's Bank. There was a similar progression in the case of Lloyd's, from being a small London coffee house to being one of the world's largest banking and insurance houses after dipping into profits from the slave trade and slavery. So two financial institutions here, well, they're still existing today, and two of the major businesses or foundations in the UK dealing with finance and banking their finances originated from the slave trade, or companies involved in the use of slaves. So that's an idea of the type of investments. If you look at the GDP, there is a dispute about the level of GDP coming from slavery and the slave economy. Some argue that it was minuscule. The trading in slaves themselves didn't really bring in much in terms of its contribution to the GDP, but the slave economy as a whole brought in a good amount of income to the UK. Statistics provided by the Gothenburg University in Sweden and the London School of Economics indicates a significant level of contribution. I'll take a look at these statistics here. You've got analyzed together, however, the economic activities involved in the triangular trade and the American plantation complex add up to a large magnitude quantitatively if compared to that of the aggregate British economy. By the end of the 18th century, the British part of the triangular trade alone incorporated economic activities equivalent to 5% of the British GDP. But there's a higher figure here. If we add the activities in the American plantation complex as well as the industries in Britain directly dependent on this, the estimated figures show the economic activities equivalent to around 11% of British GDP were directly involved in or associated with the triangular trade and the American plantation system. Activities of this magnitude can hardly be dismissed as marginal to the British economy at the time. So although 11% might sound not so significant, it's still a significant figure in terms of the size of a country's economy. If you also remember, in terms of the cotton, 20% of the population were involved in the textile industry, and most of 75% of that cotton was coming from the US plantation system. Although even there I've not talked about the contributions of sugar. And if we look at the factor of wealth in the UK's economy, quantifying our model using the observed data, we find that Britain would have been substantially poorer and more agricultural in the absence of overseas slave wealth. Overall, our findings are consistent with the view that slavery wealth accelerated Britain's Industrial Revolution. So this is from a paper called Slavery and the Industrial Revolution. And it's saying here basically that without the slave wealth, Britain's Industrial Revolution would not have taken off either so quickly or reached to the extent that it did. We show that areas with exogenously more slavery wealth grow faster, experience more structural change, develop more mills and factories, and adopt more steam engines. These are the areas, as I was saying before, where slaveholders invested their money. By the 1830s, slavery wealth is strongly correlated with economic development. Slaveholding areas are less agricultural, closer to cotton mills, and have higher property wealth. There are many things that they're saying in regards to the direct correlation between slavery wealth and the Industrial Revolution. But regions that never engaged in the slave trade show lower levels of wealth and industrial activity after the expansion of the British involvement in the slave trade from the 1640s onwards. So from the 1640s, as they became more involved in slavery and the slave trade, those regions of the UK that didn't really get involved or didn't have people hailing from those regions that were involved in the slave trade, he found that those regions of the UK didn't really develop that much. The wealth accumulated from the slave trade and slaveholding was far from evenly distributed. This is the same thing within Britain. James Penny, who was heavily involved in the slave trade, predicted instant ruin from the abolition for the British towns most involved in it. So basically is what they're saying, when slavery was going to be abolished, he was worried that those regions of the UK that were heavily involved in the slave trade and slave economy were going to lose a lot of money, or their cities were going to fall into decline or something like that. Should this trade be abolished, it would not only affect the commercial interests of the county of Lancaster, and more particularly the town of Liverpool, whose fall would be as rapid as its rise has been astounding. So it seems Liverpool grew vastly from the slave trade, the trade in slaves and the slave economy. And the worry was that when the slave trade ended, Liverpool would fall into decline. So those are the main factors I was looking at. I wanted to look at cotton, palm oil, the steam engine, and the investments going into different regions of the UK, and how the UK's economy actually benefited from the slave trade and the slave economy in real terms, not just the overall idea that it benefited. And the reports are quite specific. I didn't go into the type of formulas they used and the extent of the data that they researched. But it gives a good indication of how much slavery and the slave economy was involved in the UK's Industrial Revolution, or investing in the UK's Industrial Revolution. There's something about colonial, what this is, let me read this. I have studied the value added in the production, refining and trade of colonial sugar over the course of the 18th century, arguing that during this period it increased from around 1% to 4% of GDP. So the use of sugar alone, I don't know whether it was including in the earlier figure of 11%. But I would think that the real figure would be closer to 20% than the 11% if you include all the other factors, because this is just the Americas, the Caribbean. I've touched on palm oil, but I don't know if the economic figures of palm oil were involved. Then you have India and other countries in the global south that were colonized, and how the British made their wealth out of those regions as well. So I think colonialism played a much more significant role in the UK's growth during that period than some would like to admit. And if you look at the issue in recent years, particularly after 2020 and this George Floyd killing or murder, and the talk of reparations that rose at the time, you'll find that reparations may be one of the reasons. In fact, they've always denied the level of wealth they made through the colonial period. But specifically when it comes to reparations, they like to play down the idea that they made a lot of wealth through the colonial process. And recently, with the discussions about reparations, you can see why they want to play it down. And it was interesting that a former British minister of the just ended conservative government, you'll find that it was an African lady, this Kemi Banadok, who was saying that the colonial process and the slave trade and slave economy didn't contribute much to the British economy at the time. It's one of many. Some Africans would take the angle that Africa didn't really contribute to the British economy, or the mistreatment of Africa didn't really contribute to the British economy's growth during that period. I think there's a mindset of not wanting to be seen as the victim, those who suffered under colonialism impression, and those who they also play down the contributions of slavery and the slave economy in the British economic growth. There's maybe a denial in some way for some Africans, either on the continent or in the diaspora, who don't really want to acknowledge that their people were taken and mistreated by some others. And these others, who they somehow look up to. I think a lot of Africans look up to the British and the Western world in a misguided way, to the extent that they don't want to believe that these people mistreated their own people so much. Anyway, that was a brief look at this industrial revolution and the colonial economy and how slavery, colonialism, and the small amount, in this case, I haven't really touched fully on the African contribution, economic contribution to Europe's or England's economic growth. But I'll maybe touch on that another time. So that's it for now.